All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, I am happy to be joined by Sal Nuzzo, who is with the James Madison Institute, serving as Vice President of Policy. Sal, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Karen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned to you, our module this week for the course is about federalism, how our system came to be, how it's structured. So to get started, I was wondering if you could put into your words what federalism means or why it's something that our students would be studying at this point.
Sure. Well, federalism underlies the entire foundation behind how the United States was formed as a constitutional republic. So the principle behind federalism is that the states, the United States, the states are supreme. The states created the federal government and the states created the local governments. And so in the kind of system that we have, it was envisioned by the founders that state sovereignty and state policymaking power would kind of reign supreme over both the federal and local government structures.
Yep, cool. Well, so the organization that you work for, that you represent, is named for James Madison, who was born, I looked it up, 271 years ago.
Yep.
So what kind of thinker was James Madison, and in what ways is his legacy relevant still today?
Well, his legacy is relevant in the fact that he composed the majority of the Bill of Rights that we have. So the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution were drafted by a coalition of individuals, but James Madison was largely credited with being responsible for the authorship of them. So his idea was that within the context of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that the Bill of Rights would be basically a limiting principle document that would articulate what the individual within the system of government was free from government intervention or government coercion over. So something like the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, was not necessarily articulating that there should be no such thing as no such thing as censorship by private individuals or private companies. It was meant as a guiding principle behind limiting any form of government coercion or government mandating of speech or the establishment of religion. So those are the kinds of things that when you look at one of the founders like James Madison, who we're named after, or any of the others who were instrumental in articulating and authoring the Bill of Rights, that they were developing a series of principles to establish such that individuals were free from government coercion in a number of different respects.
That's interesting. I think on First Amendment issues, that is a big issue, and we're going to be touching on that in various modules throughout this class. When it I was going to ask you about this anyway, so I'm glad that you brought it up. It was the first of the Bill of Rights, so obviously the drafters, including James Madison, thought that this was pretty foundational, that we live in a country where there's free speech, free exchange of ideas, at least free from government intrusion, which actually ties in some way to the goals of this course. In addition to fostering an appreciation for the system itself, the course is designed to have students have an opportunity to interact constructively with one another, with people who have diverging points of views. What do you think James Madison, as the author of the Bill of Rights, might have thought about, where things are, as you mentioned free from government coercion, but there's a lot of institutions these days that relate to the government or government tangential. So on college campuses these days, how would that relate?
It's definitely a challenging perspective at this point, because one of the principles that JMI stands by is this principle of limited government and limitations of the federal government intrusion on policy, on individual rights, and on the free exchange of ideas. As public institutions, as state universities, and as so much of the public discourse has become reliant on the federal government for funding. So you have state universities that are receiving federal funds from either the Department of Education or from other granting organizations. They're increasingly becoming beholden and captured by those very dollars to whatever the policy whims of the federal government are. So whether it's Title IX or some other kind of articulation of what can or should be taught on a campus, when the federal government holds a substantial amount of the purse strings or the budget over an institution of higher education, it's very, very concerning, because you almost get into a situation where a university administration does not want to risk a sizable portion of their budget by going against what the government's viewpoint might be. And so you have this dynamic at play that wasn't necessarily at play 50 or 60 years ago. And it's growing to the point where you actually have campuses around the country that are getting started free from any form of government funding, because they do not want to find themselves captured by whatever the kind of dictates of or mandates of the federal government are at this point.
That's interesting. So even though there may not be any overt top-down, this can't be said or this must be said, there are incentives possibly that surround speech.
Yeah, carrots and sticks are very effectively utilized by the federal government. So a promise of additional funding for pursuing one area of policy or one area of study, or one adding more bloat to an administrative budget, versus a disincentive or a stick where you say, if you do not do X, you risk federal funding, becomes a form of coercion in a sense. It becomes a way in which a vast kind of maze of spaghetti of federal bureaucracy is able to kind of get its tentacles into higher education. And that's something, as from a federalist perspective, we should all be very concerned about.
So, the one thing that I've heard you speak on before, and something that I know that JMI is a big advocate of, is the concept of, the states are these laboratories of democracy, meaning states can individually implement, they can test policy alternatives. Why is that important? Why is it important maybe for a state to be able to try something and fail, or try something and succeed?
It really comes down to that very concept. And the idea of laboratories of democracy, I believe it was in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The concept is that in a nation like ours, which even back then was a large, vast kind of population and very, very diverse from state to state, we now have a nation of 325, 330 million people. The needs and policy specifics and dynamics of a state like Florida, 22 million people, growing by 1,000 a day, sizable population of elderly residents, it's going to be very different than the policy needs of a state like Wyoming. Very rural, very sparsely populated, very different health, education, and demographic characteristics. And so the concept of laboratories of democracy is one where the best policy solutions are derived from the bottom up, not the top down. And so when we talk about this, what we're trying to kind of unpack is the fact that states addressing the very specific needs of their own constituents, of their own residents, and that could be in healthcare policy, it could be in public safety policy, it could be in education policy, they're best equipped at the state level to understand the different needs of their populations. And by doing that, the best ideas kind of bubble up from the bottom to whatever is really should be in the purview of a federal solution that can be adopted nationwide. It shouldn't necessarily come first from the top down, which is unfortunately what we've seen over the course of probably the last 30 to 40 years. It's more of a top-down dictate form of policy as opposed to what the founders intended, which was bottom-up laboratories of democracy.
Sure. Can you think of, not to put you on the spot, but could you think of examples of either a positive reform that started in a few states or one state that spread, or maybe even a disastrous policy that, had it been a top-down from the feds, would have caused a lot more harm had it been done that way?
Absolutely. One recent example from the bottom up that ended up becoming a federal policy that has done great positive value for the American people has been the concept of what's called the right to try legislation. Right to try is a policy that began actually out of the state of Arizona, which came up with the idea that if you are a terminally ill patient, if you have terminal cancer or some other terminal disease, you should have the right to try whatever medication you want, regardless of its degree of approval process with respect to the FDA. Once it gets past the safe portion of the equation, it should then be able to be consumed or tried by any patient wanting to try it out. The right to try. The idea being, you're terminal, you should have that position to be able to give it a go. Arizona passed that. A number of other states kind of joined the bandwagon on that. And then eventually the federal government decided, you know what, this is a great idea. A number of states have implemented it, and they implemented a national right to try piece of legislation. I want to say it was about 5 or 6 years ago. That's a great
in that example, would the states still have the ability to, and pretend this was a policy where some tweaking was still necessary, would that federal implementation leave room for states to still develop nuance?
Okay. Yes, and with the example of right to try, there was enough flexibility within the federal legislation that states are actually adapting and trying out new elements of it in order to kind of advance the ball forward and do more in that realm. So, absolutely. The kind of contrasting example, I would say the biggest contrast of the last 20 years is probably the quote unquote Affordable Health Act, or Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, which was enacted in 2009. What it did was it attempted to shoehorn 330 million people and their health insurance and healthcare decisions into one kind of box that the federal government kind of constructed in a way that they thought would result in everyone getting access to health insurance that would meet all of their needs. The problem is that they did not take into account what we talked about earlier in terms of laboratories of democracy. The fact that the state of Florida, with 22 million people and 2/3 of them over the age of 60, is very different than the state of Iowa or Wyoming, with far different health demographic characteristics. Right. And as a result, almost everybody's health insurance has been made worse off as a result of it. The number of individuals that have been helped by Obamacare is far outweighed by the number of individuals who have either had their health insurance canceled, premiums gone up 200-300%, or do not have the same network of providers that they did prior to the implementation of the law. So the better solution would have been, for example, if you wanted to promote greater access to health insurance, block grant the money to the states and let them kind of figure out what is the best mechanism for ensuring their residents that wouldn't necessarily be some kind of amalgam of a system that didn't really work for the vast majority of the people.
Right. In other words, take the amount of money that was spent subsidizing healthcare federally and provide those same amounts to states proportionally for them to work it out for their populations. So
and originally Medicaid was kind of envisioned as something along those lines. It was meant to be a state and federal partnership borne out equally by both. The challenge has come as we entered the pandemic and as Obamacare kind of rolled out. The incentives to expand Medicaid to able-bodied working age adults became such that the states were unable to kind of turn down, for the most part, federal money that was quote unquote guaranteed. Now, Florida's one of only, I think it's 11 or 12 states left that have not done that. They've resisted, and wisely so, because at the end of the day, all we're doing is spending more money that we don't have for an inferior policy outcome in the end.
Sure. I'm going to pause for 1 minute so we can welcome Dr. Robert McClure, CEO and president of James Madison Institute. Thank you so much for joining in. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, I'm running a little bit behind today.
Absolutely. And you know what? I'm actually glad because I'm going to get to ask you a question that I asked Sal a few minutes ago and hear your totally fresh take on it. Real quick before we move to that, though, something that you were just saying, Sal, made me think of the phrase, you know, being able to vote with your feet. And so one thing that I know JMI is expert on is the idea of free market economies. But some of that may apply actually to a policy landscape where states are trying different things. If, for example, a Florida resident says, if I move to North Carolina or Arizona, their version of the Affordable Care Act is superior than, you know, Florida stops gaining that 1,000 people a day that you just talked about. Is that something that you've thought much about? How does voting with your feet, what does that mean to our, like, explain that to our students?
Sure. The best way to kind of look at this is the numbers. So if you look at the state of Florida over the last 25 years, roughly, Florida has realized over $200 billion in annual income in migration from individuals leaving their state and moving to the state of Florida. When you say the number 1,000 people a day, they're bringing their income. They get jobs, they create economic output. Florida's realized over $225 billion a year in added income as a result of people leaving. And where are they coming from? They're coming from Illinois, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. If you think about kind of the commonalities of those, they're coming from states that are high tax, high spend, very left-leaning blue states. They're just not seeing the level of value from the amount of money that they pay in taxes every year in whether it's roads or education or higher education. They're just not seeing it, and they're getting taxed and taxed and taxed. The challenge for those states becomes is that they end up having budget gaps because those individuals are leaving when they can. And in order to kind of fill the holes, they're running right to the old playbook, and they're just raising taxes on whoever is left, which creates a kind of a spiral. We're seeing it in New York. We're seeing it a lot in Connecticut. They're going back to implementing toll roads on the interstates in Connecticut in order to raise more tax money from individuals driving in the state. Those are individuals that are left there because they can't leave. Those are the folks that are kind of the least able to be mobile with their feet. And so the states are like Texas, Arizona, Florida are reaping the benefits of low tax limited government policies. And the return on investment is such that people keep coming.
Nice. Well, I'm going to turn this to Bob for a second to ask you what I asked Sal a few minutes ago, which was the organization that you lead is named for James Madison, obviously, whose impact was 250 years ago,
right,
or 271 years ago. So why is it, who was James Madison? What was his legacy that leads him to be so relevant today that you're running an organization and with his name at the head?
Well, thank you again for having me today, and we're really excited to be a part of this program. James Madison, the man, was really kind of, along with 2 or 3 other founders, kind of the brains behind what we like to call our founding documents. So whether you're looking at not the Declaration of Independence, that was completely separate, but whether you're looking at the Constitution or you're looking at the Bill of Rights, you're looking at the kind of the natural rights of humanity. Madison was the kind of the driving force behind the establishment of the Constitution and the establishment of the Bill of Rights. And he understood so much about the idea of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, the importance of divided government, the importance of checks and balances. And so he was not only the inspiration for the founding documents that we hold dear today, and much of which Sal has been talking about most recently, but he was also, you know, he was the spiritual leader, so to speak, but he was also the author of that. You couple that with the Federalist Papers and all of the other things that Madison was involved in. And he's a critical component to a republic that, while we're going through our struggles and our challenges today, has really kind of moved humanity and allowed for human flourishing exponentially in ways that no one could have anticipated in the 18th century.
What then, and this is a question to either of you, what then would you consider threats to federalism? Are there any threats looming?
Absolutely, there are. And I know Sal will be able to speak to these as well. And he's already referenced several. I think the overarching or the overreach of the federal government out of Washington, D.C., frankly, by both parties. Oftentimes, it doesn't really matter who's in charge. They continue to spend. They continue to. I gave a talk to a business roundtable just a few weeks ago. Washington is kind of doing the opposite of what the state of Florida is doing. They are trying to bring power to them. They're trying through enticements, through subsidies, through mandates, through the regulatory component, through taxation. They're trying to draw power to them in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, in Florida, under this current governor, but not just as governor, the leadership of the state of Florida over the last 30 years, they're diffusing power. They're trying to give it away through school choice, allowing parents to choose the best schools or the best educational fit for their children, through fewer regulations, through lower taxes, through aspects that we've done with healthcare and so many different areas. And so actually the state and the Washington, D.C. are actually on completely opposite tracks. So to your point, to your question, it's actually Washington, D.C. and Sal talked about Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare that is actually trying to hold on to and grab more power as opposed to giving it away to the states.
Yeah, I would piggyback and say, in terms of kind of the direct threat to federalism, I would say the level of, I think in some spaces they call it the entitlement bomb. The entitlement bomb is kind of a ticking time bomb of debt that has the capacity to explode not just the federal budget, but the dollar as a reserve currency around the world, which is largely credited with allowing the United States to become the economic powerhouse that it has been. So if you were to look at kind of a pie chart of federal spending each year, most politicians will talk about discretionary spending. Mm-hmm. Discretionary spending amounts to a very small percentage of the federal budget. The largest portion, I think it's roughly 2/3, is entitlement spending, right. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And those levels of spending are on a course not just to bankrupt themselves, but to bankrupt the federal government. When that happens, and as that unfolds, we will see very, very challenging times ahead in terms of the decisions that policymakers in Washington, D.C. and the states will have to make in order to remedy them.
And there's a final component to what Sal was saying, is that in many of these programs, there are automatic increases built in on an annual basis. So let's say the automatic increase is 10%. Okay. If a do-good elected official in Washington, D.C. says they want to make the increase 5% instead of 10%, people in Washington say you're actually cutting a program, but you're not. So if your boss comes to you and says, hey, look, I want to give you a 10% raise, but he comes back a week later and says, look, the business isn't doing as well as we thought, we're just going to give you a 5% raise. Your boss is not cutting your pay. He's increasing your pay by 5%. The same is true in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And these are the kind of accounting gimmicks that they play whenever someone tries to get control of the federal budget. Others come out and say, well, you're cutting, when in actuality, you're not cutting. You're actually lowering the increase.
Right. So interestingly, then, the constraint that states have, or at least Florida has, with the mandate of a balanced budget each year is probably extraordinarily protective of avoiding that same type of, that same type of issue.
Yeah. a couple of things in Florida's constitution that are very important. One being that balanced budget requirement. Two is there is a constitutional amendment prohibiting a state income tax. So if we wanted to implement a state level income tax, it would have to pass a constitutional amendment with 60% of the voters affirming it. So relatively off the table. But then in addition, a few years back, the voters approved a constitutional amendment requiring a supermajority of both chambers of the legislature to increase any tax or fee at the state level. So 2/3 of both the state house and the state senate would have to approve of any tax increase or fee increase in the state of Florida, which provides some pretty aggressive guardrails for how the state kind of manages its finances. And at the same time, the coffers of the state are going up and up and up. It is not a constraining principle on state government. Our revenues have been through the roof every year. We're breaking records. It's because of that commitment to limited government and low tax principles that has driven economic output, which increases the ability of government to provide more services.
Interesting. Would you say, not to pivot too much, but for students, there's 750 students enrolled in this class right now. So we have, students representing every possible background, political orientation. Is there a way to think of federalism as, it is not partisan, obviously, like the parties as they are in 2022 are not at all resembling what we had when this was founded. Is there a misunderstanding or about appreciating the federalist system places you in a certain spot? Is there a way to get around that?
I think Sal, if I could say a couple of things, I'm not sure necessarily what you mean by getting around it, but I think federalism serves both parties well, because if your students who are watching this video lean left, there are lots of states doing lots of different kinds of things that whether on the policy front, whether it's electric cars in California or toll roads in Connecticut, as Sal referenced, and they have the ability to do that, and unconstrained or less constrained, if we allow federalism to thrive, by a federal government that one day may be run by, say, a right of center party, right? If your student is a right of center person, then places like Texas and Arizona and Florida and South Carolina are doing different things. They're going in a different route. But it instead of a kind of one size fits all out of Washington, D.C., which, as Sal has already articulated, doesn't work. It doesn't work. What's important to California is not as important to Connecticut, just by virtue of size populations, the homogeneity of the population itself or not, those kinds of things. A one size fits all out of Washington, D.C. says that party in charge, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, if it's Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, that they know best for the entire country. And that just simply can't be done. So federalism actually benefits everyone, regardless of where they sit on which side of the aisle. Sal, would you agree?
Yeah. The idea that that federalism is purely a right-leaning kind of notion is just kind of antithetical to kind of our history. The Federalist Papers were actually written by folks from opposing political parties at the time. So it wasn't something where it was one-sided or kind of the left or the right. What I would stress also is that the individuals who kind of founded the system that we find ourselves in understood something very important, in that kind of an outright democracy breeds tyranny, because all you need is 50% plus one to tell the remaining, population, go pound sand, this is what we're doing. The idea of checks and balances through a system of federalism promotes exactly what Bob was talking about, and that, the needs of a state like California, with its specific demographics, with its specific geography, with its specific economic activity, is going to be necessarily different than Kentucky, and they should be. And the idea of having a system where each state's value is equal is something that has made us kind of as much of a powerhouse as we are at this point in time.
And you also get to find out what works. So, for example, Florida may make some decisions that don't really work very well, and other states might make a decision in, say, Minnesota that works really well on healthcare. And so it allows the states to experiment. It allows the states to figure out what works, and there breeds this kind of competition. So, for example, Sal and I all of us live in 12 miles from the Georgia state line. Okay. And so when you go over into Georgia, the gas per gallon is something like 30 or 40 cents less per gallon in Georgia than it is in Florida. So sometimes people who live close to the state line will make the decision to go over the state line to fill up their gas tank, or as they're coming back from Atlanta, let's say, to Tallahassee, they're going to fill up 30 minutes away right at the Georgia line because gas is 30 or 40 cents less per gallon. Well, imagine that kind of competition, not at a gas station, but in healthcare, in the tax and regulatory spirit, in the school choice and education space. That kind of competition allows people to see what works and then make decisions accordingly to what's best for their families.
I think that's great. And if that was sort of that's a great pitch into the next question, which would be if students are inspired by some of what you'd share to learn more, to get involved, or to become advocates in their own way about federalism, where would you suggest they begin? What should they do?
Sal, you want to go first? You want me to?
Sure. I would stress our shameless plug for our great internship program at JMI. More than welcome to reach out to any of us. Karen, do you have a way to kind of disseminate our contact information?
Absolutely.
We have a fantastic internship program. We have a program across not just Florida State, but across college campuses in the state of Florida, where we kind of have a college rep on, I think it's about 8 or 10 different campuses, and they produce events that kind of promote the principles of federalism. If you are interested, you can become a part of our kind of email list. We put out kind of information, whether it's our writing content or policy studies or things where we're in the news. I would also encourage individuals to become engaged with your state, with the members of the legislature who represent you. If you live in the state of Florida, it is important for you to know who is your state House member, who is your state senator. Those individuals control, as of this year, $110 billion in state spending. Now, that's a big number, but I'm going to stress something. Florida's budget, with 22 million residents, when you compare it to New York, which has about 20 million residents, 19 million residents, New York state budget is over $225 billion. So we do more with half of what New York state does, and we do it better. And so, but your state legislature controls $110 billion a year in funding for everything from healthcare to roads to education. Become engaged, find out who they are, meet with them, talk with them. It is far easier and far more valuable, in my opinion, than trying to work the halls of Congress. Your state legislators come from your communities. They are part-time. They have their own lives, their own occupations, but they come to Tallahassee regardless of party. They come to Tallahassee because they really have a heart for public service, and we are better served by all of them.
Yeah, I would add, obviously, the intern program at the James Madison Institute is incredibly robust. We have a fall, we have spring, and we have summer intern programs. If you're able or fortunate enough to be an intern at JMI, you meet all kinds of people, you learn you develop all kinds of skills, whether it's policy and research, the use of communications these days, and social media, and driving the debates that we're talking about here today. And then, on top of getting involved with your state legislature, I would say, well, back to Sal's point, we also have programs on 8 or 9 different college campuses right now, all across the state of Florida. You can learn all of this at jamesmadison.org. And then the last thing I would say is get involved with clubs and community groups on your college campus. Get involved with wherever you are, whatever your political stripe may be, get involved with those groups and then kind of begin to build and expand your network. Networking gets kind of a bad rap these days, but networking simply means building relationships. And so if you get involved on your college campus with certain groups that share your beliefs and then look to work in these different communities, you can expand and grow your network, and it will lead you to so many different areas that you can't even begin to anticipate.
Well, you all do incredible work. I've been lucky to engage with you all outside of this course. I really admire the policy work you do and the advocacy, and I appreciate you being here to talk with our students today. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Appreciate it.